There she stood in my driveway, arms crossed like a school principal ready to deliver punishment, flanked by two teenagers holding clipboards like they were on some mission from NASA. But instead of asking about landscaping or HOA dues, Karen opened with a sentence so absurd it actually took me a moment to realize she was serious. She said my Wi-Fi signal was polluting the neighborhood bandwidth and disrupting her son's online chess tournament. I blinked, thinking maybe this was some kind of bad improv sketch, but no, she was dead serious. Then she pointed to my house and declared, in front of two baffled teens and my security camera, that she was demanding my Wi-Fi password so she could inspect my network. I laughed at first. I truly did. But what started as a bizarre, laughable HOA overreach soon spiraled into a digital nightmare involving surveillance gear, spoofed signals, and a woman who had no idea she had just stepped into the home of a Homeland Cyber Defense engineer with a long memory and a very secure server room. The day had started normally enough. I had just brewed my coffee and opened my terminal to monitor a few automated scripts when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I definitely wasn't expecting the neighborhood's reigning tyrant, Karen, to show up uninvited. She had that trademark fake smile stretched across her face, the kind that tries to mask hostility but fails miserably. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun, and she wore a blazer like she was heading to a courtroom. Without waiting for an invitation, she started in on her prepared speech about wireless interference and community integrity. I kept the screen door shut. She insisted that the HOA was expanding into a new digital initiative and needed to verify each resident's network compliance. That's when I realized the two teens with her were actually part of some fake, neighborhood cyber scouts group she had invented herself. I asked to see an official document from the HOA board. Karen pulled out a single sheet with the HOA letterhead photocopied on top and the rest typed in Comic Sans. No signature, no seal, and definitely no legal standing. I told her firmly I wasn't giving out any passwords and that my network was private property. That's when she leaned in, narrowed her eyes, and said, "If you have nothing to hide, you won't mind a quick scan." I couldn't help but chuckle. I said, "If I had anything to hide, do you think I'd be using consumer-grade routers?" This only confused her. She tried to shift tactics, claiming her son had complained about getting booted from an online game every time I streamed Netflix. That's when I knew this wasn't about compliance, it was about control. Karen had no technical understanding of networks or interference, but she had just enough self-righteousness to think she should be in charge of mine. She didn't like that I was laughing. Her face twitched into that familiar HOA scowl, and she accused me of being suspicious and evasive. I countered by pointing to the security camera over my porch. I told her the conversation was being recorded and that her demands bordered on harassment. She made a show of scoffing and declared she'd return with an official notice. As she walked off, one of the teens looked back at me, clearly unsure if he was on the right side of whatever mission he'd been roped into. I closed the door, finished my coffee, and made a mental note to review my network logs that evening. A few hours later, I was back at my desk, eyes on my command terminal, when something caught my attention. There were several failed login attempts pinging one of my hidden SID. My setup isn't what you'd call average. I run multiple internal subnets for segmented virtual machines, a sandbox security environment, and a couple of decoys just in case someone gets curious. This was not random interference. Someone was actively trying to brute force their way into one of my isolated zones. I checked the signal origin. It was close, definitely within range of the neighborhood. Now I was curious. I started packet sniffing and narrowed it down. Whoever it was didn't realize they'd stepped into a honey trap. I'd created a dummy folder labeled HOA_billing 2023 with fake PDFs that would auto-alert me if accessed. I also launched a scan of local MAC addresses and device fingerprints. Within 5 minutes, I had confirmation. A rogue device using a mobile hotspot had been used to probe my network, likely parked just one house away. Karen's house. Coincidence not likely. I went for a walk shortly after sunset, phone in hand, casually running a directional analyzer app. When I walked past the edge of Karen's yard, my phone vibrated twice. Strong signal spike. Not from her home router, but from a relay, possibly a portable repeater, tucked near the hedge separating our properties. I didn't touch it, but I took photos and returned home to run deeper diagnostic. Someone was either piggybacking off her network or she had set up an extender to snoop on mine. The next morning, I got an HOA-wide email, sent by Karen, of course, announcing the formation of a Digital Compliance Oversight Committee. She claimed new neighborhood guidelines required all residents to share their passwords for bandwidth regulation purposes. Attached was a downloadable form titled Voluntary Password Access Sheet. I nearly choked on my cereal. This woman had no clue how Wi-Fi worked, yet she was appointing herself as some kind of data regulator. My response was short and polite. I replied to the group thread with a message that read, "For privacy and legal liability reasons, I decline to share any password with non-residents." That should have been the end of it. But for Karen, it only escalated things. That night, I noticed new activity on my decoy file. Someone had opened one of the fake PDFs and triggered a time-stamped alert. I traced the access point again, still near the same bush, and this time I launched a countertrace using a sandboxed virtual machine. The intrusion attempt wasn't sophisticated, but it was persistent. The attacker was running a common brute force script often used by amateur hackers, and the IP linked back to a router located 2 houses down. I cross-referenced the IP with a network name from earlier scans, HOA_guest_Karen_ext. I sat back in my chair and let out a slow breath. This wasn't just HOA micromanaging gone wild. This was digital trespassing. I could report it now and trigger an official investigation. But something in me wanted to let it play out just a little longer. I wanted to see how far Karen would go. If she wanted to act like she ran the neighborhood internet, I'd give her all the bandwidth she could handle. Carefully crafted, carefully tracked. And when the trap closed, she'd have no idea what hit her. Because she didn't know that I wasn't just some quiet guy in sweatpants working from home. I was the one who designed the defense architecture she was now trying to sneak into. And she had no idea the storm she just triggered. The following morning began with a tap on my window and the muffled sound of a camera shutter. I pulled back the curtain just enough to see Karen standing on the sidewalk, holding her phone up like she was documenting a crime scene. Her sister, whom I had rarely seen before, was with her this time. She looked like the softer version of Karen, wearing oversized sunglasses and a designer sweater that probably hadn't seen a real wash in months. Karen shouted something about interference patterns and neighborhood data integrity while pointing to my house, then loudly told her sister that my network signal was twice as strong as regulation allows. I didn't bother opening the window. I just stepped back and shook my head, noting that her obsession had now gone full conspiracy theory. I was no longer just an uncooperative neighbor in her eyes. I had apparently become some sort of rogue signal criminal in the HOA's eyes, at least according to Karen's world. I checked my email again, and sure enough, there it was, a follow-up message from Karen to the entire HOA mailing list. This time, she claimed that non-compliant residents were jeopardizing the community's digital harmony and hinted that repeat offenders might face Wi-Fi suspension if they failed to submit the voluntary form she had sent the day before. Several neighbors replied with confused or laughing emojis, and one person simply wrote, "Karen, please stop." I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my logs again and compared last night's probe attempt to previous ones. The access patterns were identical, meaning someone was running a timed scan, same brute force intervals, same script signature. It was basic enough to trace, but sloppily handled, as if the person had no idea their device was leaving a trail. I set up a silent log snare, masking a new fake network labeled HOA_guest_echo. Within minutes of broadcasting, A connection pinged from the same rogue extender near Karen's bushes. That made 3 confirmed instances. With everything captured, I contacted a colleague from Homeland Cyber Defense. Not to escalate just yet, but to get a second opinion. I sent over the logs, the connection origin reports, and even a few photos of Karen's driveway where I suspected the extender was hidden. My colleague laughed at the subject line of my message, which simply read, "Wi-Fi tyrant in suburbia." But as soon as he reviewed the logs, his tone shifted. He said it looked like someone was not only spoofing signal sources, but they might also be routing data through a third-party proxy. That would have been impossible for Karen to pull off herself. He suspected someone either gave her tools to use or she was working with someone more tech-savvy. Either way, he advised me to keep the logs rolling, not engage directly, and to notify local authorities if the intrusion crossed into personal or financial data territory. That afternoon, I took another walk. This time, I carried a hidden antenna scanner clipped to a phone battery pack in my back pocket. I acted casual, stopping to wave at a few neighbors and pet a golden retriever across the street. When I passed Karen's hedge again, the scanner lit up like a Christmas tree. I kneeled down, pretending to tie my shoe, and quickly snapped a photo of the ground beneath the bushes. There it was, partly buried under leaves, a signal repeater with a cheap plastic casing. It had blinking LEDs and was partially covered in what looked like lawn clippings. Clearly not something accidentally left there by a landscaper. I didn't touch it. Instead, I circled around the block and took a second pass. This time, I noticed something new, a small camera mounted under Karen's porch light. It was pointed not toward her own door but toward mine. Later that evening, I reviewed my newly collected data and added it to the case folder I was building. The folder was now packed with screenshots, timestamps, cross-device fingerprints, and even rough GPS signal maps from the directional scanner. I wasn't just dealing with a nosy neighbor anymore. Karen had crossed into surveillance territory. The worst part? She still thought she was in the right. Her actions had gone from absurd to illegal, and the fact that she was doing it so publicly made it all the more bizarre. That's when I got the idea to bait the trap further. I created a few decoy files on the fake network she kept probing, with file names like HOA_confidential_policies, .doc and resident_data_plan.xlsx. I filled them with fabricated information and set triggers that would alert me the moment they were accessed. Less than an hour after uploading, one of them was opened remotely from the same signal source I had traced before. The real twist came when I did a packet deep dive. During one of the connection sessions, a cached email signature was unintentionally exposed by the device on the other end. It belonged to an account under the name kgreen_securityhub. I paused for a long moment. Kgreen was Karen's last name, and securityhub sounded a lot like something she'd invent to make herself sound important. I cross-checked it with some other logs and found a mobile IP address that had briefly connected to an unsecured Wi-Fi printer from another neighbor's house last week. I texted that neighbor, a nice woman named Sheila, and asked if she had recently had any odd issues with her printer. She replied instantly, "I just found a printed page in the tray that said, 'Testing HOA range.' I thought my son did it. He didn't." Now I had a pattern. Karen, or someone using her network and devices, had been scanning and probing multiple homes. Her excuse about digital compliance was nothing more than a mask for a very real digital invasion. I wasn't sure yet if it was driven by obsession, a thirst for power, or if she had been convinced by someone smarter than her that she was doing something righteous. But it no longer mattered. She had entered a space where my skills were not just relevant, they were lethal in a digital sense. And she was still clueless about who I was and what I really did for a living. I stayed up late into the night tightening my net. I knew she'd be back. People like Karen can't stop. The idea of control becomes addictive. I crafted a new decoy folder and set it to mimic the behavior of an open FTP share. It would look like a mistake, like something that had been forgotten or left insecure. If Karen or her mystery helper went for it, I'd have their full device fingerprint and even a trace route of their outbound connections. That's when I'd be ready to take it up the chain. I was already logging with timestamps aligned to federal protocols. This wasn't just for personal vindication anymore. I was building an airtight case for what was shaping up to be one of the weirdest cyber harassment stories the agency had seen. She had no idea that every fake file she opened, every probe she launched, was just feeding me more ammunition. The final twist that night came just before I went to bed. My terminal pinged with an alert from my perimeter firewall. Someone had attempted to access my internal NAS backup system using a spoofed IP. The attempt failed instantly, but the logs revealed something disturbing. The request came through a tunnel linked to a public university network 3 states away. Someone was either masking Karen's actions or she had brought in help. And now, things were about to get serious. The morning after the spoofed access attempt, I didn't even bother with coffee. My nerves were already wired. The trace through the public university network wasn't a random anomaly. It was a tunnel connection masking a local origin, rerouted through academic servers. Whoever was helping Karen knew just enough to be dangerous, which meant this wasn't a coincidence or some misguided DIY project anymore. I pulled up the full chain of logs and ran a forensic path reconstruction, confirming that the initial handshake originated locally, likely within my HOA network radius. The reroute through the university's OpenVPN was meant to muddy the trail, but it didn't work on my system. The signature packets still carried unique fragments from the relay device, revealing the real source. It led right back to the IP registered under the same alias I had flagged earlier, Kgreen_SecurityHub. I was now staring at a clear case of attempted intrusion, with evidence linking it to someone in my neighborhood who had no legal or ethical grounds to be even sniffing my network. I made the decision then to activate a passive surveillance mode on my defense software that would automatically log and archive every connection attempt. I included encrypted session logs, device MAC IDs, and outbound URLs in the data capture. If this continued, I'd not only be able to identify the attacker but also uncover their full browsing patterns and app behavior during the intrusion. The whole setup was now basically a digital tripwire system. The moment they stepped into one of my decoys again, it would be over. That evening, just as the sun was setting, I noticed Karen and her sister walking down the sidewalk with a laptop bag slung across the sister's shoulder. They stopped near the corner of my property again, pretending to admire a flower bed while very clearly glancing at the side of my house. Karen took out her phone and tapped furiously while the sister kept scanning the area. I didn't approach them. Instead, I stayed inside, watching through my discreet porch cam while the logs began to light up. Sure enough, multiple probe requests hit my decoy FTP share, all flagged as originating from the same masked alias, but this time the connection initiated a folder scan. They thought they had access. Within seconds of the connection, my system executed the pre-written counter script. A silent capture engaged, cloning the device fingerprint and issuing a stealth ping back to their endpoint. Not only did I get their actual IP, but I also captured the device type, browser details, and a cached version of their DNS request. The final confirmation was undeniable: a temporary device ID tagged to a Lenovo laptop belonging to the same subnet that had accessed Sheila's printer the week before. The digital breadcrumb trail was complete, and it led straight to Karen's garage. I now had enough evidence to make a formal complaint or escalate directly to federal review. Still, I hesitated, not because I doubted what I had collected, but because something about Karen's obsession seemed too organized to be completely self-motivated. I dug deeper. I ran a scan through a dark web watch list I had access to via a Homeland Cyber Defense tool, filtering known device fingerprints against suspect activity flagged for local network monitoring tools. After 20 minutes of automated cross-referencing, I got a hit. One of the devices attempting to spoof my NAS had also been flagged in a previous cybercrime sweep involving residential smart devices being hijacked and sold to commercial surveillance brokers. The connection wasn't just local, it was commercial. Someone was trying to siphon data and possibly sell it. The question now was whether Karen knew the full extent of what she had become involved in, or if she had been manipulated into thinking she was leading some kind of neighborhood digital purity movement. Either way, she had placed a literal data mine in her own backyard and triggered a federal-sized red flag. I began organizing my case folder, carefully timestamping each incident, attaching screenshots, correlation chains, and raw log excerpts. Once compiled, it read less like a neighborhood spat and more like the opening chapter of a cyber-espionage case. To make things airtight, I decided to collect one more piece of confirmation. I created a fake internal email on the decoy network, titled HOA Member Info Leak Urgent. It included a false draft suggesting someone in the neighborhood had been leaking neighbor contact info to an external site. Within 2 hours, the file was accessed and flagged with a download attempt. This time, however, my stealth logger revealed more than just the device. A screenshot capture showed a browser open to a webmail account that read, kjurininvest@gmail.com. That matched the cached signature from the previous intrusion. The full email session was loaded into the browser tab. The IP matched Karen's router, and the GPS data was within 3 meters of her home. By now, I knew Karen's downfall wasn't a matter of if, it was when. I submitted the full evidence bundle to my contact in Federal Cyber Enforcement, encrypting the package and transferring it through a secure channel. My colleague responded within the hour, stunned at the clarity and thoroughness of the case. He said it was one of the most detailed residential cybercrime logs he'd seen, and that it qualified for immediate digital harassment charges and unauthorized surveillance penalties under 2 federal acts. I was told to hold off any direct confrontation, as a quiet investigation had already begun. They were preparing a coordinated visit. Despite this reassurance, the situation on the ground didn't slow down. The next day, Karen doubled down again. She printed out flyers and handed them door to door, claiming that my home was interfering with the digital harmony of the neighborhood. She told one resident that I had illegal amplifiers running at night, and claimed she was working with a technology enforcement team. I heard about it when one neighbor knocked on my door, laughing as he showed me the flyer. It had a badly photoshopped image of a satellite dish with my address typed below it, claiming I was a rogue signal source. The absurdity was unreal, but the stakes were very real. That night, I received a text from Sheila again. She said Karen had come to her house asking if she'd be willing to give router access for a bandwidth calibration check. Sheila refused, obviously, but it was clear Karen was spiraling into paranoia and possibly dragging other people down with her. I added the report to the case file and made a final log note. Subject has begun engaging other neighbors under false pretenses and pushing them toward unauthorized access attempts. Digital hysteria spreading. The next morning, my contact confirmed that 2 plainclothes agents would be arriving soon to pay Karen a visit. It was time to see what was really inside her garage. What had started as a bizarre request for a Wi-Fi password had escalated into a digital sting operation. And the only person who didn't seem to understand the storm she had walked into was Karen herself. She still thought she was on a mission to protect the neighborhood, while in reality, she was the biggest threat to its privacy and security. The game was almost over. The final click was coming. The knock on Karen's door came just after 10 in the morning, quiet but deliberate, the kind of knock that doesn't ask for permission, it expects compliance. I watched from across the street, pretending to adjust my mailbox while 2 plainclothes agents from the Federal Cybercrime Division approached her porch. They looked like they belonged anywhere but in law enforcement, khakis, polos, and friendly smiles, but I knew what those smiles hid. They were there to execute a digital search warrant based on the packet logs, spoof tracing, and device identification data I had spent the last 2 weeks compiling. Karen answered the door with a robe draped over her shoulders and a mug in her hand. At first, she looked surprised, then suspicious, and finally defiant as they showed her the badge and the printed warrant. Her voice quickly rose in pitch. She pointed toward my house 3 times within 30 seconds, waving her arms as if trying to redirect blame. But it didn't work. The agents remained calm, said nothing, and asked to inspect her garage. A few minutes later, yellow tape went up around the driveway. A mobile data forensics van parked on the corner, and Karen was instructed to sit on her front porch while the agents entered her garage with gloves and bags. Her sister arrived shortly after, jogging across the lawn in flip-flops, already shouting about neighborhood rights and overreach. One of the agents calmly explained that they had a federal warrant and that tampering with digital devices under review would be considered obstruction. Karen's sister froze mid-sentence. I watched from my window as the garage was opened to reveal exactly what I had expected. Inside were multiple signal extenders, a modem chained to a firewall-less router, a laptop with an external antenna, and what looked like 2 smart hubs connected to an unregistered server rig on a metal shelf. It was a surveillance center cobbled together with second-hand parts and dangerous overconfidence. Word traveled fast. By noon, a small crowd had gathered near the corner, whispering and pointing. Most neighbors were shocked. A few weren't surprised at all. One guy from 2 blocks away said he had been having strange issues with his Wi-Fi camera system and now it all made sense. Another mentioned how Karen had offered to optimize her router settings during a barbecue, which suddenly didn't seem so innocent. Karen, meanwhile, alternated between loud denial and quiet pacing. At one point, she tried to call someone, but one of the agents reminded her she wasn't under arrest yet, but anything she said or did could affect their investigation. She set her phone down and stared straight ahead with an empty expression, as if the reality of what was happening hadn't fully hit her. That night, her porch light remained off. Her sister returned later with a duffel bag and left again an hour afterward. The agents had already finished their sweep and taken all the equipment for analysis. Karen wasn't handcuffed, but she was officially listed as a person of interest in an active digital intrusion case. That label alone was enough to freeze her in place. The HOA president, who had been conveniently silent throughout all of this, finally sent out a community-wide message. It was a brief statement saying the HOA had never authorized any data compliance initiative and that any member engaging in private surveillance under the HOA's name was doing so without approval or liability protection. In other words, they hung her out to dry. Karen's digital crusade had now become a legal nightmare. But it didn't stop there. The next morning, she tried to flip the narrative. She went door to door, again, passing out printed flyers that claimed she was being politically targeted for exposing neighborhood vulnerabilities. The flyer blamed me directly, saying I had overreacted and used my influence to call in government allies over a simple misunderstanding. She added a screenshot of a fake email that she claimed I had sent her, but it was so badly edited it still had her name written in the CC line twice. I received 3 of these flyers from neighbors who found them stuffed in their doors. One of them came with a sticky note that read, "She's lost it." Another one said, "You warned us." I remained quiet, just as instructed. The investigation was ongoing, and I wasn't supposed to engage her. Still, it was difficult. Every time I saw her pacing in front of her house, or overheard her trying to convince someone of her innocence, I wanted to walk over and show her what a digital footprint really looked like. But I didn't have to. That night, a resident named Frank held an unofficial neighborhood gathering at his driveway. It started with just a few of us, but soon over a dozen people showed up, and the topic was obvious. Everyone had a story. Karen asking to borrow a phone, Karen offering to help troubleshoot smart lights, Karen suggesting a neighborhood-wide mesh network that she would manage. One woman started crying, saying her daughter's baby monitor kept switching channels at night and now she couldn't stop wondering who had been watching. The next day, the formal charges landed. Karen was officially served with a court summons for digital harassment, unauthorized network access, and illegal surveillance under federal statutes related to personal data intrusion. The news spread within hours. Someone even printed out the charge sheet from the court's public database and taped it to the HOA community board next to the newsletter. Karen, red-faced and silent, walked by it without looking up. Her sister didn't come back that day. Her lawn, which she used to prune with military precision, had weeds growing along the edges. Her porch light stayed off again. The queen of compliance had fallen, and she had no kingdom left. I received a call from the lead investigator the following evening. He thanked me for my assistance and said the data I had gathered played a key role in building the case. He also told me something else. Karen's system wasn't entirely her own. Someone had been helping her. A man she had been communicating with through an encrypted chat client had been feeding her scripts and configuration tools. That man had already been flagged in 2 other cases. He was likely running a local network harvesting scheme, using neighborhood Karens as unknowing or willing entry points. Karen wasn't just nosy. She had become a digital mule. With that revelation, things made a strange kind of sense. Her obsession with control, her inflated sense of duty, her blind confidence in her non-existent technical skills, it all made her the perfect pawn. But in trying to feel powerful, she had handed over her neighbor's data and privacy to someone who only saw her as a tool. The irony was perfect. The woman who tried to invade everyone else's networks had been compromised from the start. She was never in control. And that, more than anything else, was her real downfall. By the end of the week, Karen had disconnected her internet. She left a sign on her door saying, "Under renovation," even though no one saw any workers come or go. Her garage remained empty. Her house, once a hub of false authority, was now just another quiet structure with its blinds always drawn. The community, slowly recovering, began to relax again. But the memory of what happened lingered. I had caught a digital thief hiding behind a clipboard and HOA badge. And she had no idea that the man she tried to corner over a Wi-Fi password was the last person she should have messed with. The final fallout came quietly, like a page turning in a book no one wanted to finish. Karen's house sat lifeless, her once pristine lawn growing patchy and uneven, her porch littered with unopened flyers and fading HOA notices. It was as if the whole block had silently agreed to forget she was ever there. But forgetting wasn't that easy. The scars she left behind didn't just sit on driveways and routers, they lingered in the minds of the neighbors who had been watched, tricked, and unknowingly pulled into her spiral. Her silence was no longer intimidating, it was just awkward. No more announcements, no more HOA rants, no more midnight porch lights blinking like surveillance beacons. For the first time in weeks, the street felt normal. And it was strange how much effort it took to trust that feeling again. Despite everything, I wasn't celebrating. It was over, yes, but the process of cleaning up a digital mess like this wasn't just about unplugging wires and packing away routers. There were people who now looked at their home networks differently. One neighbor asked if I could check his smart doorbell settings. Another wondered if her email had ever been accessed. I helped where I could, mostly in the background, just tightening a few digital bolts and scanning for leftover vulnerabilities. What Karen had done wasn't just criminal, it was destabilizing. She had created doubt where people had once felt safe, an undoing that takes longer than court orders or fines. The legal system moved forward at its own pace. Karen was charged formally in court and pled guilty under advisement, likely hoping to avoid the media attention that would come with a trial. The judge, a sharp woman who clearly understood the gravity of cyber intrusion, handed down a penalty that matched the scale of her arrogance. Karen was sentenced to 18 months of probation, ordered to complete 100 hours of community service, and slapped with a sizable fine. But the most important part wasn't the punishment, it was the restrictions. She was banned from operating any network surveillance equipment, prohibited from participating in any HOA enforcement or committee activity, and forbidden from owning or configuring any smart device without legal oversight for the duration of her probation. In essence, the very tools she used to control others were stripped from her world. Her sister, who had spent the earlier weeks trying to defend her, vanished from the neighborhood shortly after the hearing. It turned out she wasn't just a passive observer, she had helped Karen install some of the hardware. While she wasn't charged directly, she was listed in the case files and warned by federal investigators that further involvement would put her under formal scrutiny. That was enough to get her to pack up and disappear. The only thing she left behind was a badly glued motivational quote plaque on Karen's garage wall that read, "The future belongs to the fearless." The irony was sharp enough to cut glass. The HOA itself wasn't spared either. After the dust settled, a few residents demanded transparency on how Karen had been allowed to operate with such fake authority for so long. It turned out that she had forged or heavily edited most of the documents she used and had never actually been granted the roles she claimed. The HOA president was forced to issue a public apology and step down from his position after admitting he hadn't checked the documents she'd handed him. A special election was held, and this time people paid attention. A quiet but sharp resident named Clara was voted in, and her first act as HOA president was to implement a policy explicitly banning any member from conducting surveillance or demanding access to private networks under any circumstances. She even added a clause that made impersonation of HOA authority grounds for immediate expulsion from all committee participation. Things began to return to a new kind of normal. Neighbors who had once been wary started chatting more freely. Block barbecues resumed, kids rode their bikes without being watched, and the community newsletter even started featuring actual helpful content instead of the passive-aggressive nonsense Karen used to push. And me? I slipped right back into my quiet routine, operating from my home office with the same subtle vigilance I'd always carried. I didn't want praise or attention. I just wanted stability. But even in that silence, people remembered. A few neighbors started jokingly calling me Agent Wi-Fi, and someone anonymously left a wooden sign on my front yard one morning with a hand-carved message that simply read, "Password denied." I kept it. Weeks later, I received a call from the same Homeland colleague who had helped initiate the investigation. He told me that the man who had been feeding Karen instructions had finally been identified and detained during a larger federal sweep on illegal data harvesting operations. Karen had been part of a beta test, a trial run to see how much digital information could be extracted from a residential community using basic consumer tech and a willing participant. She thought she was running the show, when in reality, she was being used as the face of something far more malicious. My evidence had helped link her setup to 2 other cases in different states, and that thread had unraveled an entire operation. My logs, files, and trace reports had quietly contributed to something much bigger than one HOA scandal. After that call, I sat at my desk for a long time thinking about how strange it was that all of it had started with one ridiculous demand for a password. It had sounded so harmless at first, just another Karen overreach. But beneath that silly surface had been a web of exploitation and arrogance that could have gone much further if no one had noticed. The difference was that I had noticed, and I had the tools to respond. Not with threats or shouting or drama, but with the quiet precision of someone who builds digital defense walls for a living. Karen eventually moved out. There was no announcement, no goodbye, not even a listing on the local site. One day, her blinds were closed, and the next, a moving truck showed up, loaded her life into boxes, and drove off. The house sat empty for months before someone finally bought it. The new family was kind, friendly, and tech-savvy in a good way. They installed a proper mesh system, asked me to help them configure it, and laughed when I showed them the decoy folders still running as a legacy joke. We shared coffee on their front porch the next week, looking out over the street that had once been under invisible siege. And so, the story ended, not with fireworks or headlines, but with silence. The same silence Karen had once filled with paranoia and false authority. But now it was peaceful. The networks were clean. The neighborhood was whole again. And if anyone ever tried anything like that again, they'd find out quickly that the quiet guy on the corner wasn't just another neighbor. He was the firewall they never saw coming.